In an explanatory paragraph in the Constitution's number 605 in the current numbering, it states that the intention of the fourth vow pertaining to the Pope was not to designate a particular place, but to have members distributed throughout the various parts of the world. For those who first united to form the society were from different provinces and realms and did not know into which regions they were to go, whether among the faithful or unbelievers. And therefore, to avoid erring in the paths of the Lord, they made that promise or vow in order that His Holiness might distribute them for the greater glory of God. It's an interesting explanation of the fourth vow. That the key to the fourth vow is that is allowing the Pope to send us where he wants because we don't know. This theme of knowledge is so important when it comes to obedience. And today I'd like to talk about this theme of knowledge as it pertains to the subjects rather than the superiors, and how we can understand that what we know is very important, and what is known is very important in our obedience. This is the universal vision of the society, was there even before the society was formally confirmed in its existence by the papal bull. This Ignatius's ambition to do great things, that he had this idea, to go to the Holy Land and all these sorts of things. He had these big views, but what he realized was that in order to really serve Christ wherever the need was greatest, where they could do the most good, that putting themselves at the disposal of the Pope was really the best way to do that. Why? Because he saw the Pope as having the most universal vision in the church of knowing where the needs were. And this is very, very important, that our obedience to the Pope is, when we talk about why the fourth vow is about being one of mission, this is why it is one of mission, because it is a vow of obedience to be missioned where the need is greatest. It is a vow at the same time, because it is about where the need is greatest, that is sometimes described as the contrary to the monastic vow of stability, the Benedictine vow of remaining stable in one's monastery, that it is sort of a vow of instability, because we are saying that where we are might at any given time, in any given mission, no matter how we got there, no matter how significant the works feels, it may not be the place where we can do the most good. We need to be open to the possibility that there is a greater good elsewhere. And so we are never stably fixed in one place. There is always the possibility that we might go elsewhere. So the thing about Jesuit obedience for the subject, therefore, is that it is directed toward this universal availability to Christ in the context of Christ's church, and it calls at its origins for us to be willing to go wherever the need is greatest in order to help souls. And I think that this is the important context to consider the complexity of Jesuit obedience from the perspective of the subject. There are kind of famous things about Jesuit obedience, both for which we are praised, that are misunderstandings, and things that we are insulted for misunderstandings. There are people who think that kind of, Jesuit obedience, kind of wink, 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 nudge, nudge. Jesuit obedience is just, the Jesuits, they can logic anything. And really their obedience is really just a way of them, they say they're obedient, but they kind of reason their obedience such, their orders such that they change what they've been told to do, and they just do whatever they want to do. So this is part of our reputation. On the other side is the reputation that comes out of the metaphors that Ignatius famously used for obedience, where he talks about that we should be, that our obedience should be blind, and that our obedience we should be like a dead stick in the hand of another person. This sort of, or like a dead body, even, he says, excuse me. So like a stick or a dead body. And all of this, all of that kind of the harshness of that rhetoric is sort of like, no, this is not Jesuit obedience. We shouldn't be thinking for ourselves. We shouldn't be interpreting obedience. We shouldn't be creative. We should be absolutely unfailingly respectful of the exact orders that we're given. So there's this contradiction, because on the one hand it's sort of like, well, Jesuits aren't obedient at all, and on the other hand, well, aren't we called to be obedient in sort of a militaristic, direct, immediate way? And both of these explanations of Jesuit obedience do not match the obedience that Ignatius himself called for. So I want to talk a little bit about what that obedience is from the part of the subjects. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit in theory first, and then I'm going to talk about it in practice in two examples from the early society. So the little bit of theory, I just want to talk a little bit about Ignatius's famous letter on obedience to the province of Portugal in 1553, where they were having a lot of trouble in regard to obedience at this time. And he famously said, "We may allow ourselves, we Jesuits, we may allow ourselves to be surpassed by other orders, religious orders, in fastings, watchings, and other austerities, which each one following its institute holily observes. But in the purity and perfection of obedience, together with the resignation of our wills and the abnegation of our judgment, I am very desirous, my dear brothers, that they who serve God in this society should be conspicuous, so that by this virtue its true sons may be recognized as men who regard not the person whom they obey, but in him Christ our Lord, for whose sake they obey." The key, as he goes on to emphasize, is, "Therefore I should wish that all of you would train yourselves to recognize Christ our Lord in any superior, and with all devotion, reverence, and obey his divine majesty, Christ's divine majesty in him, in the superior." The key of the Jesuit obedience that Ignatius wants is that we need to look for how Christ is present in the will of the superior. Does that mean that our superiors have the perfection of Christ? Does that mean that they are as knowledgeable and as loving and as good as Christ? Are they infallible like Christ? Of course, that is not what Ignatius is calling. But we need to remember that when he's bringing Christ into the matter, he's bringing in the entirety of what we know about Christ, the Christ who we came to know on the exercises, and his love and his care for us, and the Christ we know from the Gospels, from our faith, from our tradition, from our sacraments. This is Christ who died this ignominious, this terrible death on the cross, this sign that should have been a sign that God was not with him. This was sort of the perception of the world, of the Jewish mindset, and even the Roman mindset at this time. The kind of death he led, this was a sign that God didn't save him. Death, after all, is a sign of, in our kind of ordinary human imagination, of the worst thing that could happen to us. And therefore, the farthest we can get away from goodness, the farthest we can get away from God, this is a sign of our alienation from God. Death enters the world in Genesis through our alienation from God, through our sin. And so Jesus' death should have been the sign of that alienation, of that separation, of that condemnation. And yet, because Jesus is God, in his death, God becomes present, even in that darkness, even in that separation. God is not separate from us. And death, Jesus' death, becomes part of the means through which we are saved. Key to the way that we are saved, key to our eternal life, is Jesus' death. And I bring that up because what it means, excuse me, what it means is that there is no place, there is no situation that Christ cannot transform. That is to say, Christ can bring good out of anything. And so even a bad order from a superior given for bad intentions can become an occasion of grace. We are trusting ourselves ultimately to Christ. And yes, we want good superiors, and our superiors need to work hard, should work hard to bring Christ's way of loving and serving and caring to bear in the way that they serve. But the ultimate one whom we trust is Christ. And we trust by virtue of our vows, by virtue of the foundation of the society, by virtue of the fact that this is Christ's society, not Ignatius's society, not even the Pope's society. This is Christ, who is the ultimate founder of our society. We trust that Christ will work through our structures. And so the call of the subject is to look for Christ even in the most unlikely of places, even in the order that is most difficult. And therefore, the next thing that Ignatius says in this letter becomes particularly important. The goal is that we make the superior's will our own in such a way that it is not merely the effectual execution of the command, but an interior conformity, whether to wish or not to wish a thing done. Jesuit obedience is not blind in that sense. It is when Ignatius is using these metaphors of a blind obedience or a stick or a dead corpse, he's using, first of all, tropes from the Middle Ages. These are not original things that he's saying. He's talking about the wholeheartedness of our obedience. He's talking about us being looking not through our eyes, but through the eyes of our superiors and through the eyes of Christ through our superior. He's talking about us conforming ourselves actively, not passively, to the will of our superiors. And the stick and the corpse are not intended to say, this is perfectly passive. It's to say that it is perfectly submissive, that we are perfectly willing to do what Christ has called us to do. And that's the thing. It is not an act of passive obedience, but an act of obedience, that what we are called upon to do is to work to agree with our orders, to look for where Christ is calling us. And so when we get an order, once we've done our bit in terms of representing what we know, if we get an order that we don't like, we think is wrong, well, we share with our superior what we know. And we say, would you still make this decision knowing all of this, knowing who I am in a conocer sense, knowing what the situation is in a saber sense, knowing all these things, would you still make this decision? We're allowed to argue and to present and to represent. But once the decision has been made, then all the effort we went in trying to make sure that our superior made a better decision now is to be directed toward making the superior's will our own, toward seeing, okay, where is the goodness? Where is Christ? Where can Christ turn what I perceive to be darkness and separation and death and problems into an occasion for grace? We're seeking Christ in our superior. And why are we doing that? Because we believe that we cannot always see, that we do not, that's the part about the abnegation of our own, the resignation of our wills and the abnegation of our judgments. We're saying, I'm not always clear-sighted. I don't always know. I'm going to trust in God. I'm going to trust in a sight that is greater than mine to see where it is that I am called to serve. So that's the overall context that I wanted to say for obedience, this very active obedience that Ignatius calls us to, this active obedience by which we represent, and then when the decision is made, we work to make ourselves conform to his will. Well, where is there discernment in all of this? Well, there's discernment in all of this, of course, exactly in that process. How do we discern what to say? How do we discern what to do in order to go forward? And the temptation that we have is the same temptation that our superiors have, the temptation to despair. There's a temptation to give into a logic of desolation, to give into a logic that leads to a crucifixion without hope, as opposed to following the consolation of God, following where Christ can still bring life, even from a situation that we do not like, or that does not appear to us at first pass to be life-giving. So when we look at what this sort of theoretical obedience that Ignatius describes in the Constitutions and in his letter to the province of Portugal, when we look at this theoretical obedience in practice, we see that it immediately gets complicated. And I will tell you a few stories and then just talk about those complications. Tell you a story about Diego Laínez. So in 1552, Laínez was the provincial of Italy. Ignatius is still general. And he has suggested, there was a Jesuit who had been working at a church who had been working at a church in Venice, and he's been called away by Ignatius. And the prior of the church is not very happy about the fact that he's lost his Jesuit. So he goes to Laínez to ask him about this. And Laínez says, well, you should ask Ignatius for a replacement. And so he tells the prior that he can contact Ignatius and ask him for a replacement. And Laínez himself, when he contacts Ignatius, says to him that he's not happy that this Jesuit had been called away. He represents that to Ignatius. He also, at the same time, in the same letter, has sent a candidate for the society, somebody who might become a Jesuit, to Rome, but he didn't when he sent this candidate to the society, he didn't tell Ignatius what his opinion of this man were. He just sent him without a letter. And these three things combined, telling the prior he could write to Ignatius, complaining about Ignatius's decision, and sending the candidate to Rome without giving his opinion, generate a response from Ignatius that is rather harsh. In fact, it is so harsh that Polanco, the secretary of the society, Juan de Polanco, is the one writing the letter. But as sometimes happens when Polanco had to write a letter when Ignatius was saying something particularly harsh, Polanco makes very clear that he himself is not saying these words. He is saying exactly what Ignatius has told him to say, because it clearly bothers Polanco that he has to be so harsh in his communication. And so he says the following to Laínez, this great Jesuit, second general of the society, companion of Ignatius's. He says, "Our father," referring to Ignatius, "our father is not a little vexed with your reverence, Diego Laínez. Our father is not a little vexed with your reverence, and so much the more in proportion as the faults of those who are greatly loved weigh heavily on those who love them." So he's saying Ignatius is really pissed because he loves Laínez so much that Laínez's faults bother him a lot. "He bids me tell you," see, Polanco doesn't want to say it himself, "he bids me tell you some of your defects, that your reverence may know them himself. He does not want your reverence's advice except when he asks for it, and less now than before you took up your present charge, because in the administration of it you have not gained much credit with him." Ouch. This is an incredibly harsh statement on the part of Ignatius. Well, what's going on here? What's going on here? Well, what bothers Ignatius? It bothers Ignatius that Laínez has not told him what he thinks of the candidate. Ignatius has not gotten the information that he needs, saber, that kind of knowledge. The informational knowledge he needs to make a decision. Similarly, he does not like the fact that Laínez told this prior of this church, this non-Jesuit, to write to him, as opposed to Laínez writing to him himself, to ask if this should be done. A fault of knowledge. And Laínez is complaining about a decision that Ignatius has already made. This is not representation. The decision has already been made. Okay, what Ignatius is upset about is that he doesn't have the knowledge that he needs, and that Lainez is not respecting the way that Ignatius expects obedience to work. And he comes down harshly on Lainez. And we might contrast this harshness when we look at the case of Bobadilla, who's constantly doing crazy things and just sort of living his own life, picking his own ministries, having fun with the nobility in Europe. And it seems like no matter what he does, Ignatius never really reprimands Bobadilla. Ignatius kind of gives Bobadilla free rein. Well, why is he being harsh with Lainez, whereas he's giving free rein with Bobadilla? I would venture the following theory. This is the brilliance, I think, of Ignatius as a superior. Ignatius knows what Bobadilla and Lainez are capable of. Bobadilla has a lot of faults. I'm not saying that Ignatius doesn't have faults in the way that he treats Bobadilla. Probably he gave Bobadilla a bit too much free rein, but he also knew that Bobadilla was incredibly talented and that it wouldn't work to reprimand him. That the decision that Ignatius had to make in terms of Bobadilla was the harm worse than the good? Because Bobadilla could not be reined in by reprimands. Reprimands were going to drive Bobadilla out. And maybe that's the decision that Ignatius should have made. Maybe that's some of your opinion on the matter. But I think what Ignatius decided was there is so much good that Bobadilla can do. And yes, Bobadilla may not be living obedience well, but he's furthering the mission of the society in what he does. And it's worth it from Ignatius's perspective. But with Lainez, Ignatius says, Lainez needs to learn the way this works. He needs to learn that you need to be completely transparent with your superior, but that you also, that's the knowledge that he didn't have about the candidate and all that, but you also need to trust your superior. And once the decision has been made, you need to get behind the decision and not complain about it. Ignatius is schooling, in the positive sense of the word, Lainez. He's trying to educate him because, in fact, he loves him greatly, as Polanco notes. He sees in Lainez the possibility of teaching him the complexity of what it means to be obedient, where we have to, on the one hand, be transparent, and on the other hand, we need to work to conform our wills to the wills of our superiors. And this is how we serve Christ in the society. Ignatius had different styles of governance for different Jesuits. We see similar dynamics about the importance of knowledge in obedience and manifesting ourselves honestly in another case where Ignatius treats with Hieronymo Domenic, who was the provincial of Sicily. In 1553, Polanco writes on behalf of Ignatius Domenic, "Your Reverence should have no scruples to dismiss the Jesuits." He's asking if he should dismiss Jesuits. And Polanco says, "You should have no scruples to dismiss them because you have the power from our father, from Ignatius, to exclude those youths who are not reputed suitable for the society. Indeed, in such a case, he will be dismissed ipso facto as absolved from vows if it is done in conformity with the constitutions." So this is a case where Domenic is worrying about whether he should dismiss some Jesuits who are clearly not suited for the society and whether he has the authority to do this. And Polanco is saying, of course you have the authority. You have Ignatius's complete trust, this wonderful trust that Ignatius had in his subject, who is himself a superior. A year later, less than a year later, in February of 1554, Polanco says to Domenic on a different matter, "Our father, speaking to me again, has told me to write to your reverence that you are not to dismiss anyone sent from here without first advising us and having received a reply." Wait a minute. He just said in August that Domenic had Ignatius's complete confidence in terms of dismissing people, and now it's February, and he's saying, don't dismiss anyone without asking us. But wait, is that what he's saying? No, he's saying, don't dismiss anyone sent from here. So here's the thing. The issue at stake for Ignatius, and this is very similar to the issue at stake for Ignatius with Linus, is, do I know the situation? I, Ignatius, know the situation. And is the person informing me of what I need to be informed of? See, in the one case, Dominic had informed Ignatius, I want to dismiss these people. And Ignatius is like, well, this is in your jurisdiction. Go ahead and do it. In the other case, Ignatius is concerned that somebody who Ignatius has accepted to the society, not Dominic has accepted to the society, someone sent from here, someone who was sent from Rome. And he wants to make sure that Dominic doesn't think he has authority to kind of countermand Ignatius's judgment in that case. So the question here is that on the one hand, Ignatius wants to empower people to live out their responsibilities in the society. On the other hand, he wants that empowerment, that living out, to be one that is in constant dialogue with superiors. Our superiors need to know what's going on. And when our superiors have already made a decision, we need to conform our decisions to our superiors. This is the complicated dialogue of obedience, a dialogue that is about care for the person, but also care for the mission. And Ignatius is trying to teach people like Linus and Dominic this kind of obedience, where we are caring, where part of our care is rooted in our knowledge. Two types of knowledge, as always: knowledge of the men, the Jesuits, and knowledge of the situation. And what's the vantage point from where someone can see the whole situation and all the men involved? From the superior's vantage point. And we need to respect the decisions made on that level, because we need to respect two things. One, the person of Christ present in that this is Christ's society. But also, we need to respect the universality of that vision, that people in those positions can see things that we cannot see, because they know things that we do not know, and they know people sometimes on a level that we do not know people, our brothers in the society. And so there is this important conversation that goes on in obedience, where on the one hand we're representing, on the other hand we're figuring out how to conform our wills, whether on the one hand we're informing, on the other hand we are exercising our own judgment with creativity. This is the complicated dance of obedience. It's a dance that requires, it's an exercise that requires discernment. That we not give in to negative interpretations, to the logic of despair, but that we look for the good, that we look for where Christ is and where Christ is calling us. That's the invitation of discernment and obedience. We are to be obedient, but we need to discern well in order to be obedient, because ours is not a passive, but an active obedience. Thank you.